and the City of Ann Arbor Natural Area Preservation. So welcome, Maya. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Fabulous. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And thanks for hitting all the highlights too. That was good. That made me sound good and cool. I'm digging it. Well, I'm very excited to be here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a wonderful, fabulous trip planned for all of you. We are going to go on a crash course for wild ones all across the River Raisin Watershed. So we're going to be covering a number of different topics this evening. I'm not even going to wait. I'm going to jump right into it. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my current organization, that is the River Raisin Watershed Council, our missions, more information about the staff and board and membership, and then touch on our service area, which it's one slide right there, but it's actually the whole presentation is really about the service area, which is the watershed itself. So I want to quickly touch on the history of the watershed. We'll go over the glacial history a bit, talk about the indigenous nations that were unceded from this area, and a little bit about the effects of colonization before we take a dive into what habitats today we've got on our watershed's lands, including the wetlands and the influence of agriculture, which is a pretty big part of the watershed today. So that's going to be a major part of what we talk about. And then we'll take some looks at the success stories and the work that still needs to be done within the River Raisin Watershed. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in and get to the mission of the River Raisin Watershed Council. And that mission is to inspire those behaviors that promote stewardship, much like many of the wild ones are undergoing some stewardship on their lands or public lands around the area, to improve water quality within the River Raisin Watershed, and then to encourage that public participation to protect, preserve, and enhance the watershed. We don't want to just keep the watershed the same old humdrum way it is right now. We want to make the watershed better all the time. And then the background to this slide, this is one of my favorite trees ever. This quirky bark right here is the hackberry. This is a floodplain tree. And so I will be sure to share this slideshow with Paul and Kate, and they can send you copies of it if you would so like, because this is a really, really cool tree, the hackberry. So our staff, we have grown greatly in the past few years. It used to be myself, Steve May, our executive director, and Lydia Lopez, our water stewardship coordinator. But just this year, we've added an administrative coordinator and assistant in Sarah Woith and Isabel Ugansky. We are really excited to have them on board, and everybody is doing their very utmost to achieve our mission goals in and around the watershed. This group is a treasure to work with, and I encourage anybody who is in the Lenawee County area here in southeastern Michigan, drop by our office in Tecumseh and come visit us and hang out and chat with us about the work that we do. We also have a board that meets once each month to run an executive committee meeting. The board members are all members of the watershed. Sometimes they are individuals who own land within the watershed. Some of them are appointed by the counties themselves. So we have reps from Washtenaw County and Lenawee County and Monroe County on there. But if you're interested in getting more involved with our board and our organization structure, please feel free to let me know. I can send some more information to you. Our organization is primarily run through municipal memberships. So municipalities within our service area help support our organization. And we do have some corporate partners and some individual sponsorship as well. So if you'd like to become a member of the Watershed Council, memberships for the year are $25. And then memberships for seniors, veterans, and students are only $10. And you can find more information about that on our website. I'll get the contact information at the back end of the program. Now we get through and into some of the really fun stuff. So this, of course, is the River Raisin Watershed outlined in red on this screen right here. The River Raisin Watershed covers over 1,000 square miles in total, and the main stem of the watershed itself is about 139 miles long. The watershed touches 5 counties. It touches Lenawee, Hillsdale, Jackson, Washtenaw, and Monroe counties. And then actually secretly, if you look on the screen here, you can see we dip down into Ohio. That secret 6th county down there is Fulton County, Ohio. And all of this watershed is all part of sort of this Oak Openings region and this former lake plain of the historic Lake Maumee, which was the early Lake Erie. So we'll talk a little bit about that during the glacial history, but I just wanted to give an overview of that. The River Raisin has a couple of cool claims to fame. The total watershed size, we're not the biggest watershed out there, but we are still larger than the state of Rhode Island, which is a nice claim to fame. And we were listed in Ripley, believe it or not's World's Records book for quite some time as the world's crookedest river. So we had a record of the world's crookedest river. And then of course we are a tributary river watershed into the Western Lake Erie Basin. And we're going to talk about a lot of the different factors that sort of influence us as a result of that, of being part of that larger Great Lakes watershed and the Western Lake Erie Basin of note. So we'll get a little bit into the glacial history of the region. As many of you know, starting about 1.4 million years ago and stretching to about 10 to 12,000 years ago, there was great glaciers that were rolling over the land, and they would come and they would crush everything up down into the bedrock, and then they would retreat and leave all these glacial features behind on the landscape. And so this is just an example of some of the features that might be left behind in some of these regions. Glacial hills like drumlins and eskers and moraines, glacial ponds like kettles, braided stream networks that were a result of some of the water flowing off of those glaciers and underneath the glaciers. Something that's very interesting to me about the glaciers is that the ancient rivers that were in this region sort of formed these soft riverbeds. And as the glaciers advanced and retreated over time, what was happening was they would dig into these riverbeds. And so the formation and the shape of the lakes that we have today comes from some of these ancient rivers like the Laurentian River, the Huronian River, and the Aragon River or Aragon River. So these lakes did not come from nothing. They came from ancient rivers, which I find to be really interesting. As those glacial sheets advanced and retreated, the maximum extent of Johnsonian glacial age stretched to just south of Michigan. So the entire River Raisin watershed at some point or another was entirely covered by this mile thick sheet of ice. And as a result, there was a lot of mixing of soils and sediments that was happening at that time. And so our soil maps and the topography of the region has been greatly, greatly influenced by the advancement and the retreat of those glaciers. And then as they advanced and retreated, we were left with this wonderful landscape of today with our Great Lakes region. So that of course includes Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. And as the glaciers came and retreated, there are different timelines about when particularly the indigenous nations were on this landscape, but we are today on the unceded territories of several indigenous nations. And it's interesting, these nations did not long ago have a written record. Many of their traditions were oral. And so I am constantly looking for good resources for which tribes were in our area, what were their cultural practices like, and I want it from the mouth of the people who were here. And so I have used a couple of different online resources to try and help find out which unceded territories that I am calling in from today. So one of the resources that I really like, it's a resource called Whose Land? And this is a resource provided by Indigenous people outlining the regions that they are saying that this is our unceded land. This is where we came from. So you can see on this map, this is southeastern Michigan. This is Jackson right here, Ann Arbor up over in this red region, and Tecumseh, sort of where this blue and purple come together, Adrian, Michigan. Further to the east is Lake Erie. So we are just west of Lake Erie in this photograph. And so as I went through and I explored, I found that we are today on the unceded territories of tribes like, and I'll go to the next slide, the Peoria, tribal nations like the Anishinaabe. This is the Confederacy, the Three Fires Confederacy, which included tribes like the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe. And then nations like the Fox and the Sauk, nations like the Miamia, and then nations like the Wyandot. So many of the experiences that we have today with things on the landscape that are called Huron. That's actually a French word. That's the French name for the indigenous nation, which called themselves the Wyandot. So those are the unceded territories on which I am calling from today and on which my watershed runs. And before the River Raisin was the River Raisin, it had an indigenous name. And so the indigenous name of the Raisin prior to the colonization was Namezipi. And this meant River of Sturgeon. So this right here is a picture of 2020. This was an 80-inch lake sturgeon that was caught in the St. Clair River. And of course, the St. Clair River connects straight to Lake St. Clair, which dumps out into the Western Lake Erie Basin. So we know that despite all of the different changes that have happened to our landscape, we still have some of these incredible, amazing ancient fish out there, these great, huge lake sturgeon. So this lake sturgeon was actually caught by that young man in the middle picture there and was later released back into the lake after this picture was taken. So that fish is still out there and still providing all the wonderful ecosystem services and population support that a huge old fish like that can provide. I've heard it estimated that an 80-inch fish like this probably weighs about 150 pounds, which is really quite incredible. These are huge old bony fish, very, very wonderful. And I know that many of you here at Wild Ones are very interested in native landscaping. And I don't know if any of you have had any experience attending webinars put on by a man named Joe Pitawanakwat, but he's a great resource he's really interested in the indigenous names of plant species and their medicinal uses and things of that nature. And attending one of his webinars once upon a time, I found a really, really cool connection where he took a look at this plant right here in the Ojibwe language. This plant is called namepin. It means sturgeon potato. This is a plant that is commonly found in floodplains. It's really tolerant to shaded areas, so it likes those rich hydric soils. The American name, the English name for this plant is wild ginger. Wild ginger. So I found that to be really interesting, that connection between the name, the sturgeon, and then the namepin. There was an ecological connection to be made there as a result of the language. So we know that these are both things being related to sturgeon. And it's true that sturgeon will go in the early springtime up into these floodplains, in these floodplain forests and other regions, and access food sources that they might not normally be able to access in other parts of the year. And these wild ginger, this namepin, has a very starchy root. And so they'll go down and they'll get down and they'll eat that starchy root as a spring resource in the early springtime during those flood periods. So really, really cool piece of ecology right there. And then of course, some of the first colonizers to come to this area were the French fur traders. And so they came and they were interested in either trapping furs themselves or at the time trading with indigenous nations for some of those fur resources. Primarily, they were after muskrat and beaver and some of those really warm, fur-bearing, water-resilient animals. So they were here utilizing some of the different wetlands that were on the landscape in order to access those animals. And something that they observed all along the river was all of these wild grapes that were growing. And so they ultimately ended up calling Namezipi, the River of Sturgeon. They renamed it to the River Raisin. And in French sentence structure, river comes before the proper name. And so instead of the Raisin River, which is what we might call it in American English, the River Raisin is a French holdover from some of the first colonizers to this area. And of course, as time came and went, we moved on past the fur trapping period and we moved into the industrial area. So the watershed changed a lot at this time. Channels were straightened and much of the marsh around the mouth of the river in the city of Monroe was lost altogether. And then industry began to move in. And at the time, there was a lot of canning that was happening on the River Raisin, and there was a lot of paper mills that were moving into the River Raisin. So I actually have a quote that I want to share with you a little bit about a famous person who was involved with early River Raisin activities. And that quote has to do with William C. Sterling. And for those of you who are familiar with the area, you might recognize that name because there was there is a park, a state park, Sterling State Park, named for Mr. William C. Sterling. So industries sprang up along the River Raisin shores, including paper mills, manufacturing plants, even municipal dumps. Back during the 1870s, waste was freely released into the waters of the River Raisin, causing major pollution issues. And so Mr. W.C. Sterling, he filed a suit against paper mills that were in the area, because at the time, he was running carp farms actually out of some of the marshes that were down in the mouth of the Raisin at the time. And so he wanted an injunction placed against the mill. And what happened in the end was Mr. Sterling was awarded $23,000 for the loss of his carp, but the polluters were continuing to dump this effluent, and there was nothing actually done to address the root problem of pollutants which were flowing into the River Raisin at the time. And so this story about where Sterling State Park got its name, I pulled from a book that I really enjoy called Menomen. And it's the story of wild rice in Michigan. So for anybody who's interested a little bit in that story, that's from the book Menomen, the story of wild rice in Michigan. It's a great resource. And so things went on like that for quite some time. And as a result, there was a number of environmental detriments that occurred. And until the Clean Water Act was passed in the 60s, there wasn't a whole lot done to fix up a lot of those habitats. But many of our habitats today still managed to remain in relatively good condition. And I wanted to dive a little bit more into those. And then we're going to circle back to maybe some of those regions that suffered a little bit more. And we're going to talk about what we're actually doing as a result of some of those pollutants that have gone into the water. So today we have a number of different kinds of ecosystems in and around the Raisin watershed. And one of those ecosystems is wetlands. And so these are wetlands. These wetlands are ecosystems that are saturated or inundated with water for varying periods during the growing season. So this might be water that is available temporarily. It might be just during flood seasons. It might be water that is standing for longer hydro periods. So hydro periods are wildly varied. They might be as simple as it floods for 2 weeks, and if the soils stay hydric and there's hydrophilic plants at that site, that would be considered a wetland. Or it might be that maybe this site is wet for 2 years and then dry for 5 years, but could still be considered a type of important wetland ecosystem. So I just wanted to show a couple of different kinds of these wetlands. So again, varying hydro periods, and then those hydrophytic vegetations and soils that developed under these variable conditions. So wetlands are really dynamic systems. Some of the most common wetlands that we have are things like emergent marshes. For me, that's normally the type of wetland that I think of as the very first type of wetland that pops into my brain. So these are the ones that we commonly see right along the shores of rivers and lakes in our region. These are shallow water wetlands. Plant species include things like the pond lilies, pickerel weeds, arrowheads, bulrushes, and cattails. So these are resources that are wonderful for a lot of our amphibians in and around the state. A number of our frogs use these. And then emergent marshes are also really important habitat for a lot of our aquatic macroinvertebrates. So I'm thinking of things like the larval stage of our dragonflies, larval stages of different other types of flies. Actually, there's a lot of different types of flies that spend an aquatic stage of their life cycle in places like emergent marshes. And then we have a lot of unique caddisfly larvae that occur in these emergent marshes as well. And those are the fun ones who build the little homes that they tend to like to live in. So they might build these out of some of the fibrous root material from some of the pickerel weeds and the pond lilies. Sagittaria species, so arrowheads, also occur in these types of wetlands, these emergent marshes. And I think in the late summer, that's one of the best times to see these marshes because all of the pond lilies are in full bloom at this time. It's a really wonderful place to go and visit. And then, of course, a lot of our other reptile species also tend to use these emergent marshes. So this is where you tend to see a lot of your turtle activity happening, especially our state turtle, the Michigan state reptile, is actually the painted turtle. So that is my fun state fact of the day. Another type of wetland that we have includes places like floodplain forests. These are bottomlands. They might be deciduous or deciduous conifer mixes. They tend to occupy low-lying areas adjacent to streams and rivers. They don't always have to. They can get, you can get some of these floodplain forests along lakes as well, but most commonly among more dynamic systems like streams and rivers. And so plant species here include larger vegetation like silver maple, musclewood. We talked about that name pin earlier, that wild ginger, stinging nettle, places like that. Floodplain forests can also be really wonderful areas to go see spring ephemerals. So a lot of the land that was developed in the Lake Plain regions during the colonization period, when we were changing a lot of the landscape, most of the land that was changed into agriculture was higher land. It was easier to work. So some of these floodplain forests and these bottomlands, they remained untouched. And so plants that are really sensitive to disturbance did a really good job hanging out in these floodplain forests that were mostly left to their own devices. So this is a great spot to see things like green dragon, jack in the pulpit, trout lilies, various trout lily species, and trilliums. Floodplain forests are a wonderful place to go and catch some of those guys in the early spring. And then there's a special type of wetland called a vernal pool. Many of you might be familiar with these. These are small isolated wetlands, again, that tend to occur in isolated settings throughout Michigan. These are another very dynamic system. So they're not all going to be the same all the time, and the plant assemblages reflect usually the dominant landscape of where they occur. So I have listed on this slide some examples, including swamp white oak, dogwood, willow, and then they can get some of those floating plant species, including things like duckweed, Lemna minor. Some of my favorite vernal pools that I know about actually also have a pretty common assemblage of buttonbush. So occidentalis. But they tend to occur pretty often in these vernal pool systems. So vernal pools are small wetlands. They are seasonally flooded, but they do spend a period of their hydro period without any water at all, and this keeps them fishless. So these vernal pools are key ecosystems for a number of unique flora and fauna on the landscape, including things like spotted salamanders and spotted turtles. And then in that plastic spoon down there, that is a fairy shrimp. That's a special type of aquatic macroinvertebrate that occurs in these vernal pools during these very short hydro periods. And vernal pools are special because they can occur in as little as 2 months. They might have a really short, maybe 2-month hydro period, and they might be semi-permanent, where there's a vernal pool that stays wet for a year or two, and then it dries out for a year or two. So again, when we're identifying these on the landscape, a lot of what we're leaning on is evidence of use from these obligate species like the spotted salamander, or some of that evidence of those hydric soils and hydrophytic plants on the landscape. So lots and lots of different kinds of wetlands. These three are the most common kind in the River Raisin Watershed. And we also have a special type of wetland called a prairie fen. So fens occur where groundwater-fed springs reach the surface, and the flow rate and volume of the groundwater through a fen strongly influences the patterning of the different vegetation that occurs on the landscape. And so this is another one where it varies wildly by site. But if you get a chance to come up and visit the River Raisin Watershed, we have the Ives Road Fen. This prairie fen is off of Raisin Center Highway out in Lenawee County. It is a beautiful, beautiful area, and there's a really active work group that meets out there regularly in the spring and the autumn. So the fen itself is completely off trail. There is no trail leading out to the fen. And so my recommendation on the best way to experience the Ives Road Fen is actually to visit the Nature Conservancy Michigan website or send me an email and get in touch and learn more about volunteer opportunities. That's going to be the best way to visit these fens. And prairie fens are really interesting. They contain a lot of rare flora. So if you are a person looking to check some different kinds of lady slippers and orchids off your life list, or Indian plantains, or just other unique kinds of species that don't occur just anywhere, this fen I know has some really cool plant species. So it's one that I really recommend everybody consider taking a look at. So outside of the wetlands, we also have a lot of agriculture in and around the River Raisin Watershed. The primary bulk of our watershed that I showed in one of those early slides falls within Lenawee County, and Lenawee County is 70% agriculture. There is a lot of agriculture happening within our watershed. And so agriculture plays a huge part in a lot of the conservation work that we do on the landscape in order to restore the River Raisin Watershed. So agriculture today, again, Michigan's home to over 53,000 farms. It covers 10 million acres. We produce more than 330 unique kinds of farm products each year. For those of you who spend a lot of time in the countryside, you might recognize some of the plants I'm about to show you. One of the fascinating things about Michigan that I think is going to become a major source of maybe income, but also potentially future contention over conservation practices is the sheer number of different unique farm products that we produce. Michigan is the second state in the union as far as diversity of crops. So we are beaten only by California, and at the rate that anthropogenic climate change is advancing, it is likely that California might fall behind us. And so we're going to be a major producer as far as the future goes, and finding a happy relationship between agricultural land use and conservation is a really important thing that everybody needs to be thinking about, and that the River Raisin Watershed Council particularly has been deeply involved in. So I'm going to show a couple of pictures of crops right here. I encourage everybody to think about if you've seen these crops before, if you know what they are. This picture right here, this is one of our farmer leaders, Ed Scheffler, who is a big proponent of best management practices, and he is in a field full of soybeans right here. So for anybody who guessed soybeans on this first picture, ding, ding, you got it. This is a pretty common crop in Michigan. You've probably seen this one before. This is one you'll see people cutting often in June and July. This is wheat. I'm not teasing you. This is another one. This is like an easy one. I think everybody's probably pretty familiar with the view of big old rows of tasseled corn in this picture right here. This one's a little bit trickier. I don't often have people get this one correct, but I do know of at least one operator within the River Raisin Watershed who is growing this crop right here. Primarily what this person is doing is using this as like a corn syrup, like a competing product to corn syrup. So this is sorghum. For anybody who is unfamiliar, you can get sorghum syrup, and it's similar to corn syrup. It provides a lot of the same sweetness and texture differences that you might expect out of corn syrup. So sorghum is a new crop that's kind of moving into the raisin watershed. And so a lot of this agricultural industry is leading to this eutrophication of our Western Lake Erie Basin and parts of the raisin itself as well. And so eutrophication is this process by which fertilizers are running off of these crop fields, and they're getting into the waterways and causing not only some sedimentation as a result of some of this runoff, but the eutrophication itself is that increase in blue-green algae that's happening. A lot of times what people tend to think of when they think of eutrophication was the instance where the city of Toledo lost all access to their drinking water for about 3 days. I don't know if anybody on the call experienced that. But that is something that was a major wake-up call for a lot of watershed councils, a lot of state agencies. Just everybody was very concerned after that happened. So the reduction of eutrophication is a huge focus of the Watershed Council and many of our sister watersheds in and around the Western Lake Erie Basin. And this view from space, you can really see how turbid that water is in the Western Lake Erie Basin and throughout Lake Erie in general. Now, Lake Erie is the shallowest of all of the Great Lakes, but there are still things that we need to do to make sure that that lake is safe for not only human use, but for animal use as well. We want to make sure we're not creating hypoxic zones. These are those dead zones that the oxygen is all sucked out of the water. Essentially, the way that hypoxic zones work is when you get these flash explosions of this blue-green algae. Not only do they create toxins in the water, but when they die, they actually suck all the oxygen out of the water as part of the decomposition process, and that can cause massive fish kills in and around eutrophied areas. It's a big problem, and so it's one that we have spent a lot of time focusing on in the Western Lake Erie Basin. The good news is we do have success stories, and we are getting work done in the Western Lake Erie Basin and in the River Raisin. So this is a picture. This is all of our staff and board that we took at our last executive committee meeting. We were really pleased to be there. Everybody's really excited in that photo. So the projects that I'm going to mention, these are River Raisin specific projects. They're in an effort to meet the state of Michigan's phosphorus reduction goals of 20% by 2020. Of course, that date has passed. We are in 2023. Happy New Year to everybody. And then 40% by 2025. So we are still working towards that goal of a phosphorus reduction of 40% by 2025 within the River Raisin, as mandated by the state's adaptive management plan, in an effort to reduce some of that eutrophication in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Of course, one of the major things that we're doing is working with farmer-led conservation, particularly the Farmer-Led Conservation Working Group. It's the real name of the organization. It's a bit of a mouthful, but they are doing wonderful work on the ground. So this is encouraging farmer participation in the Michigan Agricultural Environmental Assurance Program. That's MEAP. For anybody who might be from Ohio, this is the Michigan's voluntary program. It's like H2 Ohio. Their branding is much better than our branding. I think H2 Ohio is much catchier than MEAP, but the ultimate goal of both of these different programs is to implement best management practices on the landscape. So these best management practices can include a whole variety of different kinds of things and sort of reflect a little bit more what the operator is doing on their land than it does any particular specific like crop. So the crop and the land usually go together, but the best management practice really depends on the land itself more than the crop. So the work of the farmer-led group is to connect farmers with education opportunities and institutions and ultimately get some of those MEAP verifications through the state. So in 2021, I don't have the numbers for 2022 quite yet, but in 2021, there were 340 new verifications. There was 6,000 total new verifications for the program. They did things like educate, they worked on recycling and water use, they helped mitigate aquifer disputes and various different things. So some of these best management practices can include things like cover crop, where you plant crops so you're not leaving bare soil and allowing a lot of that runoff. It can be programs like installing water control structures. These are structures that are attached to a drainage tile on a farming operation, and they help keep the water in the tile so that the plants have more time to take up some of the fertilizers and nutrients that are available in that soil, instead of having it just run off into the drainage ditches and ultimately into the River Raisin and then further into the Western Lake Erie Basin. So there's a couple of different kinds of programs that we encourage farmers to take on in order to meet some of those best management practice recommendations as set forth by the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. We also work to monitor and make sure that stream health is doing well. The River Raisin itself runs an Adopt a Stream program. This is a study of the aquatic macroinvertebrates. We have been doing this program since 2002. So we have over 20 years worth of data, just over 20 years worth of data. And we have some really wonderful partners at some of our local institutions like Dr. Jim Martin, an entomologist at Adrian College, and Dr. Carly Kratz, who is a professor at the Lenawee Intermediate School District. Both of them are wonderful partners to our organizations. I just wanted to give them a shout out and thank them for their help. Presently, the River Raisin Watershed Council is working on a watershed report card in partnership with the University of Maryland. So we're taking this historic data and we're taking a look at how things are looking. The last big data crunch was in 2016, and we were trending very flatly. So we weren't seeing very many big increases, but we weren't seeing drops either. We were seeing a lot of steady holding on the River Raisin, which ultimately we'd like to see more upward movement, but we are glad not to see downward trends. And we're hoping, as a result of some other programs that I'm going to talk about, that we are going to start to see some more upward movement in the diversity and the health of some of these aquatic macroinvertebrates throughout our watershed. Other programs we do include things like invasive species monitoring. This is usually in partnership with our colleagues over at the Jackson-Lenawee-Washtenaw Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. That's another one with a long name. We usually just call them JLW SISMA. And we do, you can see in that photo, my colleague Shika's got a crawfish trap. And so she is checking to make sure that there is no invasive crawfish at one of our local ponds in the River Raisin Watershed. We also do things like river cleanups. We remove log jams, clear trails, manage invasive species, pick up trash, and more. A watershed is anywhere where the water flows into a common basin. So for the Raisin Watershed, that's not just the river itself, it's all those uplands as well. So part of the reason that we are working in those ag fields is to help keep the water clean. And so that's true in many of the places throughout our watershed. Partners on our river cleanups have included corporations, municipalities, nonprofits, individuals, scouts, school groups. We'd love to get wild ones out there. We work with just about anybody who asks. I actually had my very first river cleanup of the year this past weekend on the 7th. We had a local company that was just itching to get out there. They couldn't wait for spring weather. And I said, why not? Let's get out there and do some work. So that was really exciting. I was glad to see that the cooler weather did not scare them away from being outdoors. And then, of course, we want to do things in some of our more urban, suburban matrix regions as well. So we aren't focusing exclusively on agriculture or exclusively on some of these more natural areas. We want to make sure that we're reaching everybody throughout our entire watershed, our entire service area. So we are getting ready to partner again this year on a Master Rain Gardener class. We are offering an in-person class for those of you that might be interested in the Saline, Michigan area up in Washtenaw County. Or for those of you who maybe aren't local, we do offer an online class as well. It's going to be every Thursday, 10 a.m. to noon, starting February 23rd and running until, what's that second date on there? March 23rd. So there is still opportunities to get into this class. This is a virtual hybrid class. And the goal of this class is to train you and arm you with all the tools that you need to actually build a rain garden on your property. So these are wonderful resources. The other professors in this class are really great. Also, I enjoy working with them very much. And I would just strongly recommend checking it out. It does have a number of partners. All of the partners listed at the bottom are active currently, but there have been a lot of partners to this program in the past as well. So really, really great connections to be made with the Master Rain Gardener group. And then this is the current big project that we're working on in the River Raisin Watershed. We're doing a removal of the Brooklyn Hydroelectric Dam. This dam it's located in the upper reaches of the River Raisin Watershed, and it formerly was used for hydroelectric power. It's privately held at this point in time and actually is not in use at all. This is what somebody affectionately referred to recently as a bathtub dam. So it's basically creating this mill pond in the city of Brooklyn, and water's flowing over and going out, and it's not really generating any power. The dam itself is starting to fail structurally, and it is not influencing the river course in any kind of positive way, except to block fish passage. So this dam actually does not have a fish passage device on it, and is therefore a detriment to local wildlife diversity. So far, this high hazard dam project has received $800,000 through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then another $252,000 from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. So this has been a really big project so far. It's one that we are really interested in completing. We've got a number of partners on board. Dam removals can be really interesting problems, but we're really excited to have really good buy-in so far. Everybody's very interested in seeing this dam removed. Partially because in the upper reaches of the River Raisin Watershed, there's really healthy, strong fish habitat up there. So we're getting really good pike population. We're getting really good, just lots of angling opportunities in the upper River Raisin. And this is the Irish Hills area. So there's a lot less development, both today and historically. So there were not as many paper mills. There was not as many canning mills going on up there. So this region of our watershed is some of our healthiest water in the watershed. The removal of this dam is actually going to lead to 44 connected miles in the upper River Raisin. It's going to be a huge win for fish populations, for mussel populations, and for local recreation opportunities. We're hopeful that as a result of this project, we're going to be able to continue to work on some of these dam removal projects in other parts of the Raisin as well. So this is a really big project. It's something that the Watershed Council is really, really proud of, and I am very happy to be able to share it with all of you today. So that was my crash course in the River Raisin Watershed. I know it was a lot. I covered a number of different kinds of topics, hit on them all relatively briefly. If you want to reach out to the River Raisin Watershed Council and contact us for more information or become a member or come visit us, we are so excited when people do all of those things. So you can visit us at our website. It's www.riverraisin.org. You can give us a call. Our phone number is 517-264-4754. And our email address is rrwc@lenawee.mi.us. And actually, any emails sent to that particular email address go right to me. So if you have a specific question about something in the presentation tonight that you don't get a chance to ask just now, because I think I'm going to get a chance to open it up for questions in just a minute here. But if you don't get a chance or you think of it later, please send me an email and I'm happy to answer that question. And then I used a number of resources throughout my presentation tonight. So I have a couple of resource pages added on to the end of this presentation. But other than that, I am going to go ahead. I'll leave this slide up for just a minute in case anybody needs to take down some of that contact information. And I will open it up for questions.
Hello, so if anyone has any questions, they can put it in the chat and then we will forward that to Maya. You know, it's great that I love the River Raisin. I mean, the River Raisin's right in my backyard, and Maya's seen my yard, and many of the Wild Ones members have seen it too. And it's just great to see the river. I've lived here many, many years, and it actually has been cleaner than when I first moved. So, and I see a lot more activity on it, wildlife activity. So it's great.
I'm really glad to hear that. Often the raisin has a bad reputation because of all the agriculture that happens in and around the watershed, but current water sampling does suggest that actually the quality of the water is getting better, and we're hoping to see some of our aquatic macroinvertebrate populations start to reflect that as we continue to sample and survey them.
Okay. Oh, here we have a question from Frank, who says, what does removing logs do for restoring a river? Seems snags were always there.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So river systems are really dynamic, some river systems more so than others. And the River Raisin, it earned that, that Ripley Believe It or Not's accreditation of being the world's crookedest river. Whether it truly is or not, it is a very dynamic, flashy, crooked river in the Western Lake Erie Basin and in Southeastern Michigan and in the Oak Openings region in general. So rivers that are a little bit more stabilized, I actually tend to think of the Huron as being something that's a little bit more stabilized in this region. They don't tend to have as many snags or log jams or other kinds of undesirable features on the river itself, but the Raisin has a lot more of them, partially due to that serpentine nature. The reason that we remove the log jams is because they prevent navigability of the river primarily. So it's a recreation concern and an access concern in many cases, but also because sometimes these log jams can lead to larger blockages, which can threaten roads. And then part of the issue is also when working on these log jams, they tend to be a place where trash collects. And so it's really upsetting to see trash going into the river at all. But if trash is moving through the watershed, there are instances where maybe it can get dumped out of the watershed through various means, whether that means it's going to an anthropogenic location like a dam and getting taken out there, or when the water rises, it gets carried away by the floods and left in some of those floodplain forests. Not ideal. I don't like to see that. But when it hits these log jams, it really stacks up and actually can get sedimented into the banks of the river. And that's not good for stabilization. And it's also just really bad for the soil to have a lot of that trash butting up against it and taking away some of that riverbank. So we tend to leave habitat, right? So we want to leave some of the good habitat that goes in, some of those wind tips that go in and the branches, and it's really good angling for smallmouth bass and those sorts of things. But when it's a major blockage, we like to make sure that we're taking those out to prevent a lot of those other issues that are happening. Yeah, that was a good question.
Okay, we've got one more here from Kate. She wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about the infrastructure changes that will be needed when the Brooklyn Dam is removed,
Yeah,
if and how the removal will affect the lakes in the Irish Hill area.
I'm so glad to hear this question. So, um, okay, I want to make sure I'm not getting too excited. I don't want to like dump everything out at once because we're actually having a public meeting for the Brooklyn Dam removal coming up on January the 26th, I believe it is. Let me just double check. Yes, so we are having an open house at the Brooklyn Sportsman's Club for anybody who's a local to talk about the Brooklyn Dam removal. This isn't necessarily like a meeting. This is sort of an open house event where myself and some of the other regional experts who have been working on this dam removal project are going to be at tables, like waiting to chat with people, and I'm really excited about it. So as for the infrastructure of the Brooklyn Dam removal, so the Brooklyn Dam is a privately held dam. It's right in downtown Brooklyn. It is really, really similar in almost every way, shape, and form to the Midland Dam, which failed a number of years ago and flooded a neighborhood and hurt people and destroyed houses and just that was a really bad outcome. So the state of Michigan, unfortunately, has a number of orphan dams in and around the state. The Brooklyn Dam, thankfully, is not one of those orphan dams, but these dams are old, they're failing. For those of you unfamiliar with the Brooklyn Dam, it is a 14-foot earthen dam. So it is something that's built up out of sod and soil and other earthen materials. Presently, the dam is on private property and it is starting to fail. There has been some seepage, some very concerning seepage happening in and around this dam, and it is in an urban center. And so a failure of the dam could lead to a lot of the same problems that happened with the Midland Dam failure, where there's injury to people and destruction of property, which we really don't want to see. So I mentioned earlier, somebody recently used this phrase bathtub dam, which was really funny to me, but was a really apt description. And essentially what that means is presently the way that the dam is functioning is that water that is flowing in is flowing out. And so the dam isn't doing anything for any kind of flood control, and it's not going to change water levels drastically in any kind of way. Now there's a park right there on the dam called Swain Park. And I had somebody recently asking me, hey, isn't this going to cause more flooding in Swain Park? And so I spoke to some of the hydrologic experts who had been doing some modeling of what the flows were going to be like post-removal. And that was the person who told me, no, it's a bathtub dam. So essentially what's going to happen is they're going to create a new riverbed essentially where the old earthen wall is. So the only thing that is going to be impacted by the dam removal is actually the mill pond, which is all on private property. So Swain Park should not experience any additional flooding. Now, this is kind of a wicked problem because what's happening right now is we're seeing, due to anthropogenic climate change, we're seeing more flooding all over, full stop. So we're probably going to see more flooding in Swain Park, but not because of the dam removal, just because we're getting more of these 50-year storms or these 100-year storms or these 500-year storms, which are dropping more intense rainfall in a shorter amount of time. So we'll see flashier flooding in Blissfield, Michigan. This is another city on the River Raisin, as much as we'll see in Brooklyn, Michigan, which is far to the headwaters where this dam removal is happening. So yeah, so that was a really good question. Yeah, I like talking about the dam a lot. I'm really excited about it. One of the things that we did, one of the things that actually we do expect to have an impact is the resedimentation that's going to occur as a result of the removal of this dam. And so this is the part that's really cool for me that I feel very blessed and lucky to be a part of, which is we're doing mussel surveys to help protect the native mussel populations in the resedimentation area. So at the time that the dam is removed, you'll see not only a lot of construction happening, but you're going to see a lot of our team out there. Some of us are going to be snorkeling and we're going to have the full face mask and everything. And we're going to be finding mussels that are going to be in that resedimentation fallout zone. Because mussels don't move very well, we're actually going to be relocating them to safety ourselves. And part of what's really exciting about this project is we found a population of state-threatened wavy rayed lamp mussels. So this is a rare mussel species that we found in our impact zone that we're going to make really good, sure care of, that we're going to protect and make sure that that population is going to be okay. So I'm really excited to be able to help those critters out.
Okay, we have one more from Frank. Is the watershed affected by any CAFOs?
Oh, CAFOs. Okay, so this is a good question. CAFO, for those who are not familiar, that stands for Confined Animal Feeding Operation. And this is a type of agricultural practice. Factory farms are an example of a type of CAFOs. Not all CAFOs are factory farms, but all factory farms are a type of confined animal feeding operation. And so the CAFO, we do have, I think, 6 CAFOs that are within our watershed. The state knows who they are and all about their operations. We do have CAFOs in our watershed. We do have occasional impacts on our watershed from CAFOs. Generally, what's happening there, so I talked a lot today about eutrophication, which is normally coming from non-point source runoff. That's that fertilizer runoff that's coming from all over ag fields from all over southeastern Michigan. CAFOs and then water treatment plants for wastewater are 2 separate sources for what we call point source runoff. So this is like, oh, we know that there was like a spill and it happened here at this time, and this is how much material was lost. And so we do occasionally get spills from some wastewater treatment plants in our watershed, and we do, in the past year, we've had like 1 or 2 incidents with spillage from certified CAFOs in our watershed. Typically, the River Raisin Watershed Council, we're a fully 501c3 nonprofit organization. We don't deal with those directly. Usually, we can provide some more information for people who are interested, but it's usually the state who goes out and does what needs doing as a result of some of those point source runoff events.
Oh, great. Well, actually, I have a question.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there any in the more narrow areas of the river? Is there a lot of an increase in beaver activity?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked this question, Paul.
Because I mean, I had one that I think was in this area, but it's too wide here because it took all the bark off of the cottonwood tree, and it's like, what is this? And I've never seen an actual beaver here.
Okay, so this is straight from the horse's mouth, which is fabulous. So I've had a number of people ask me that very question, and I too was curious about beaver activity in southern Michigan. So I reached out to the Department of Natural Resources State Fur Bearer Specialist, and his name is Adam Bump. He's a very, very nice gentleman. And I said, Adam, are there more beavers in Michigan? Like, I gotta know. I feel like I'm hearing a lot about all this beaver activity. And he said, well, currently, population studies have not suggested an increase in beaver population, bottom line. However, what he suspects anecdotally that we're seeing is beavers are not as shy around people anymore. So there's a lot of this, I believe there's a word for it, and I think I'm blanking on it. It has to do with a lot of these cosmopolitan species that we have in and around our human activity, urban, suburban areas, right? So things like skunks and raccoons and opossums and all of those little mesocarnivores that we tend to think of as like some of our like trashy wildlife, right? They've become a lot more used to human activity. And so they're a lot less shy around human activity. And so the state fur bearer specialist said, there's not really been a big increase in beaver population bottom line, but it seems like beavers are becoming a lot less shy about their activity. So they're not staying as far away from people.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, I privately wonder, I don't have any evidence to support this, but I wonder if urban suburban sprawl has also started just bringing us closer to them. So maybe there's not more beavers, but we're closer to them all the time.
Because there's a real good book on beavers by Ben Goldfarb. It's and that's the name of it. It's called Eager. It just tells about all these things, how it really creates all these habitats. And it's just really interesting book.
Oh, they're fabulous. So the floodplain forest I mentioned earlier, like that's a really great spot to find beavers. There's a preserve for anybody who is local to this region. It's Nan Weston Preserve over off of Sharon Hollow Road out near Manchester, Michigan. That's a great spot to go and see a beaver wetland. There's beavers out there. They're active. They're hanging out. I haven't seen the adults themselves or any young or anything like that, but I've seen lots and lots of evidence of beaver out there.
Great, thank you. If anyone has any more questions, we'll just take one more and that will I think that's actually it. So I really appreciate it. It's been a great presentation. I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to even doing a little more around here.
Yeah, thank you all so much again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Oh, wait, I got one new message. Let's see what this is. Oh, it was a great class. And then the other one was engaging presentation. And they love the inclusion of the Indigenous community. So, all right. Well, thanks, Maya. And I will be talking to you soon.
Thanks again, Maya. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And if you want to rewatch the presentation, or if you know of anybody who wanted to see it and missed it, tell them to keep an eye out on our YouTube channel, and it will be on there probably in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye.